Every town has its mysteries, but Pinewater's mystery lived alone in a cabin by the lake. Morning mist clung to the reeds at the edge of Pinewater Lake, curling like silent breath along the shoreline. The sun hadn't yet fully stretched over the hills, but Elliot Rowe was already outside, his silver hair glinting faintly beneath a worn woolen cap. He walked the gravel path encircling the lake with slow, deliberate steps, the collar of his jacket turned up against the October chill. To the occasional jogger or early dog walker, he gave a brief nod, nothing more. By the time the town stirred awake, Elliot had returned to his modest cabin. The place looked untouched by time, its cedar siding grayed by weather, its windows half concealed behind ivy and aging lace curtains. On the porch sat a simple chair and a pair of muddy boots, always lined up just so. Inside, he flipped on the kettle, unfolded the local newspaper, and waited. When the kettle whistled, he poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the breakfast table facing the lake. He read slowly, as if savoring the quiet more than the headlines. At the dockside diner, warmth and noise chased away the outside chill. The bell over the door jingled constantly as the regulars shuffled in. Doris, the owner, shuffled behind the counter, placing saucers beneath thick white mugs, sliding out plates of scrambled eggs and toast with the efficiency of decades in service. Sheriff Nolan sat near the window, sipping from his chipped cup. He had the look of someone always half listening, eyes scanning beyond whoever was talking. Today, it was Doris who leaned in to whisper, "Melinda's at it again." He raised a brow. "The checklist?" Doris nodded. "Says she's got a list of code violations ready for today's meeting. And guess who's at the top?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the back corner, a group had gathered, the usual suspects of the Pinewater Homeowners Association. Melinda Price sat straight-backed, legal pad in hand, reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose. Her lips were drawn tight. Around her, HOA members murmured, heads turning toward the diner window that looked out toward the lake. "He's never at town meetings," one whispered. "Not even listed on the community registry," another added. "I heard he has no trash pickup scheduled. Isn't that suspicious?" Melinda cleared her throat, silencing them. "The man in the cabin hasn't filed a single community compliance form. He didn't sign the fall leaf pickup list. No visitors. No mail for weeks, except grocery deliveries. We owe it to the safety of Pinewater Ridge to ensure everything's proper." By mid-morning, the meeting concluded, and Melinda drafted a formal letter. The language was carefully worded, though the intent was unmistakable, a request for access and verification of code adherence. She signed it with an elegant swirl, placed it in an envelope, and marched out to the community board to pin it. At the cabin, Elliot stood at the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze. The crunch of footsteps on his gravel path didn't surprise him. He opened the door before the knock landed. A boy from the general store handed him the envelope. "Miss Price said it's important," the boy said, eyeing him curiously. Elliot smiled gently and nodded. "Thank you." Inside, he read the letter once, folded it carefully, and opened the drawer beside his reading chair. He placed the envelope inside, flattening it atop a bundle of other papers. Beneath it, edges yellowed with age, sat a stack stamped with an old but legible county seal, land ownership documentation, faded signatures, and topographic maps with red notations. In the diner, Melinda addressed the group again. "If he doesn't respond within 48 hours, we escalate. Sheriff Nolan, I hope you'll be available." The sheriff sipped his coffee. "Let's not rush things, Melinda. The man's quiet, not criminal." "Quiet can hide all sorts of things," she replied. Back at the cabin, Elliot closed the drawer and turned toward the fire. The air carried a slight chill, and he added another log to the hearth, his expression unreadable. Most folks would have argued. Elliot just brewed more coffee. The morning after the letter arrived, the wind rolled colder off the lake. Low clouds pressed down on Pinewater Ridge, muting the gold and rust of the trees into a soft, ghostly palette. Inside the cabin, the warmth of a wood stove pushed back the creeping chill, casting flickers of orange across the walls. A kettle whistled gently on the stovetop. Elliot moved with quiet precision, setting out a cup, spooning grounds into the percolator, and opening the window just a crack to let the fresh air in. On the fridge, tacked with a small horseshoe magnet, Melinda's letter sat beside an old, slightly faded photograph, a woman in her 30s with wind-blown hair, laughing as she pulled a trout from the water. Her smile was wide, eyes joyful. Elliot paused a moment, his gaze softening, then returned to the task at hand. He rolled a sheet of cream-colored paper into the Remington typewriter that occupied the small desk by the window. The keys clicked methodically as he typed his response, a brief, impeccably worded reply, acknowledging receipt of the HOA letter, and affirming his compliance with all relevant codes pertaining to his privately deeded land. He signed with a flourish and set it aside to dry. Meanwhile, at the town office, Sheriff Nolan sat beneath a mounted deer head, nursing his second cup of coffee and reading last week's paper. The place was quiet, it always was on Thursdays. He wasn't surprised when the phone rang. "Nolan." "It's Melinda Price," came the voice, clipped and impatient. "Has there been a follow-up?" "That man hasn't responded. And I was told you were making a visit this morning." Nolan rubbed his temple. "I said I'd look into it." "It's been less than a day, Melinda." "Sheriff," she warned, "if Pinewater Ridge loses its integrity because we're lax on enforcement, that's on your department." He didn't answer right away. "I'll take a drive," he said simply, and hung up. The gravel crunched under his tires as Nolan turned onto the narrow lane leading to Elliot's cabin. The trees closed in thick around the path. When he parked and stepped out, the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. He knocked once. The door opened almost instantly. "Sheriff," Elliot greeted with a calm nod. "Coffee?" "Black," Nolan replied, glancing inside. The cabin was not what he expected, every surface clean, the shelves orderly, the floor swept, the air scented faintly of cedar and old books. A chessboard rested in the corner, mid-game, against an opponent long gone. "Cold morning," Elliot said, pouring coffee into two mismatched ceramic mugs. "Colder than yesterday," Nolan agreed. He accepted the mug and took a seat near the window. Elliot sat opposite him and reached into a drawer. Without flourish, he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a copy of a deed, stamped and notarized, with boundary maps clearly delineating the cabin and its surrounding land as private property, exempt from HOA jurisdiction. Nolan skimmed the top page. "Kept everything in order, I see." "I don't like misunderstandings," Elliot said. Nolan smiled faintly. "Neither do I." They sipped their coffee in a silence that felt oddly comfortable. A creak of the floorboards turned Nolan's head. At the doorway stood a tall young man with dark hair and uncertain eyes. "Brian," Elliot said evenly. The young man gave a small nod and lingered near the threshold, clearly unsure whether to step in. "My son," Melinda had once mentioned offhandedly. "He doesn't say much, but he sees everything." Elliot simply gestured to the empty chair beside him. Brian didn't sit. Instead, he scanned the room, the framed photo on the fridge, the worn keys of the typewriter, the fire dancing in the hearth. Nolan's phone buzzed against the table. He answered. "Yes." "Have you arrived? What did you find?" Melinda's voice was shrill. Nolan looked at Elliot, then out the window to the lake. "There's nothing wrong up here," he said, and hung up. Moments later, he stood. "Thank you for the coffee, Elliot." Elliot walked them out, the sheriff with his easy gait, Brian still silent but glancing back one last time at the cabin before following. Once alone again, Elliot stepped back inside and locked the door. He moved to the far wall and opened a tall wooden cabinet. Behind its shelves of books and loose papers was a narrow safe, disguised as an old fuse box. The key turned with a soft click. Inside, resting among a few thick folders and yellowed blueprints, was a detailed map of Pinewater Lake. Lines were drawn across the water in red ink, with markers along the shore, rangeland stamps, and annotations noting boundary shifts and acquisitions stretching back decades. Elliot folded the map carefully and returned it to its place. As he closed the safe, his expression remained calm, but the quiet around him was no longer quite so undisturbed. Pinewater Fall Fair was meant for pie contests and hayrides, not HOA surveillance. The town green behind the municipal hall had never looked more festive. Cornstalks rustled in the corners, strings of warm bulbs lit the booths even under the dim gray sky, and the scent of cinnamon, baked apples, and fresh hay drifted through the air like memory itself. It was late October, 50 degrees and dipping, and everyone was layered in plaid jackets and woolen scarves. Laughter rose from the hay maze, children squealed on the carousel, and over the speaker system, a group of students launched into a proud, slightly off-key rendition of America the Beautiful. Elliot arrived alone. His boots moved silently over the packed dirt as he stepped onto the festival grounds, a modest pie carrier tucked beneath one arm. He wore a brown cardigan over a white-collared shirt and a fedora that had seen more than one Idaho autumn. The only sign of age beyond his silver hair was the small stiffness in his stride, the kind that came from years of weathering more than just seasons. He made his way toward the baked goods tent, where Doris stood behind a long table, straightening pie plates. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said with a smile, brushing flour from her apron. Elliot nodded. "Brought a cherry ginger. Thought I'd try my luck." Doris took the pie gently and slid it among the others, adjusting the card that read Entrant Number 12. As he stepped back, his gaze crossed the lawn, and met Brian Price's. The boy stood near the cider stand, hands stuffed into jacket pockets, eyes scanning the crowd like he didn't belong anywhere in it. When he saw Elliot, he froze. There was no smile, no wave, just an expression of discomfort. He looked away quickly. From behind the community tent, Melinda Price emerged with a clipboard in hand and a thin, practiced smile. The HOA tent was impossible to miss, bright banner reading Pinewater Community Watch, flanked by laminated sheets of unverified residents and community guidelines reminder. Beside it stood a folding whiteboard, freshly inked with residents required to confirm current address, today. Melinda's heels clicked purposefully on the plywood walkway as she approached the baked goods booth. She glanced at the pies, then back at Doris. "We're pulling entry 12, she announced. Doris blinked. "Beg pardon?" Melinda didn't repeat herself. She turned to the growing cluster of fairgoers. "The HOA has protocols. Entry to contests is limited to confirmed residents." This submission came from someone who has refused to file a verification form. "It's not personal, it's policy." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs rose. A gray-haired man in a veteran's cap frowned. "He's lived in that cabin longer than most of us have had gray hair." A young mother asked, "Didn't he help replant the North Trail last spring?" Doris, behind the table, bristled. "That man's been paying for everyone's cider here since before Brian was born." Melinda ignored them all and crossed the entry off her clipboard. Elliot didn't speak. He stepped forward, lifted his pie from the table with slow care, nodded once to Doris, and turned away. His back was straight, expression unreadable. But before he walked off the fairgrounds, he paused. Standing just beyond the crowd was Mrs. Aldridge, once secretary of the HOA before Melinda's rise. Her gray shawl flapped in the breeze. She walked up beside him and spoke low, almost not moving her lips. "I still have the original charter. Back when it was about keeping fences mended, not people out." Elliot met her eyes. A slight nod passed between them. Then he turned again, the pie balanced steady in his arms, and headed for the gate. But as he passed Melinda, his eyes locked with hers. No words, no drama, just a look that carried more weight than any protest. Later, as the crowd thinned and the pie contest continued without entry 12, Melinda returned to the HOA tent. She frowned at the cider spilled across the welcome table and picked up the stack of sign-up sheets. And there it was. A folded page, typed in clean, red font, laid precisely atop the clipboard. Owner since 1995. Pinewater Ridge Charter Exemption. She read it twice, then looked up, scanning the grounds. But Elliot was long gone. When the sheriff drops an unexpected comment at the diner, the regulars start whispering about a decades-old rumor involving the lake. The air over Coldwater Lake hung thick with fog, casting a silvery veil over the pines. At Mabel's diner, the smell of maple syrup and bacon battled for attention with the creak of vinyl booths and the soft jingle of the doorbell. It was coffee hour, unofficial, but sacred. Walter sat alone near the back, in the booth closest to the jukebox that hadn't played a song in 15 years. He nursed a steaming mug of black coffee, his eyes watching the fog shift through the diner window like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. Mabel refilled his cup with the practiced grace of someone who'd been doing this long before the town had a stoplight. "You always like it best when the fog rolls in," she murmured. Before Walter could respond, the door jingled again. Sheriff Alden stepped in, brushing cold dampness off his shoulders. He made a slow arc around the counter, nodding to a few regulars before sliding into the booth across from Walter. "Quiet morning," Alden said, lifting his coffee. "Depends who you ask," Walter replied evenly. The sheriff tilted his head, studying Walter a beat too long before adding, almost to himself, "Funny how folks forget who bought what around here." The diner fell still. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. A paper stirred but wasn't turned. Mabel's hand froze over the register. Across the room, a retired teacher named Arnold squinted. "You talkin' about the lake again?" he asked. Alden offered no clarification. "I remember the surveys," Arnold continued. "Used to be county land, wasn't it? Until the 77 reassessment. Or was it the 79? Another patron chimed in, "I thought the paper mill owned part of it." No, Mabel said softly, "I recall Edna saying her brother sold some back lots to a quiet fella, back before we had an HOA. Karen, seated near the counter with her ever-growing folder of bylaws, perked up. "We've already verified zoning. The HOA has jurisdiction up to 30 feet from the shoreline." "That's so?" Alden replied, looking nowhere and everywhere at once. Karen shifted in her seat. "We're also proposing a new ordinance, noise restrictions after dusk. There have been disturbances." "Walter barely plays his radio," Mabel muttered. Karen's voice sharpened. "It's about setting precedent. Ensuring order." Walter's spoon stirred quietly in his cup. Later that afternoon, the fog had lifted but left behind a chill that clung to the skin. Walter pulled into the back lot of a forgotten storage facility just outside town. The metal roll-up door groaned as he opened Unit 14. Inside, dust hung suspended in the still air. He stepped forward, pushing aside an old canoe and lifting a tarp to reveal a squat, rusted metal box. It opened with a creak, revealing faded documents, brittle with time, and a large, folded map. He ran his hand over the paper slowly. The outlines of Coldwater Lake stretched across the page, dotted with annotations in blue ink and the stamp of a notary long since deceased. A name was circled in the upper margin, his. The wind picked up as he locked the unit and drove home. 2 days later, a sealed envelope arrived on Walter's porch. HOA letterhead. Legal threats dressed as civility. Karen's signature curled across the bottom. Walter sat in his cabin's armchair, the letter in one hand and the map in the other. His eyes scanned the notice, then slid over to a small calendar pinned near the stove. He circled a date. And smiled. The town gathers for its fall fair, but behind the hayrides and pie contests, tension brews beneath every handshake. Orange string lights crisscrossed the square, draping the Coldwater Fall Festival in a warm, nostalgic glow. The scent of cinnamon, baked apples, and kettle corn hung thick in the crisp November air, mingling with the faint smoke from the fire pit near the cider booth. Laughter rang from the hayride queue, and old fiddles played cheerful tunes by the quilt display. On the surface, it was tradition, charming, comfortable. But something different flickered beneath the smiles this year. Karen moved through the crowd like a campaigner, clipboard tucked under her arm and a crimson scarf looped just so. "We want a clean, orderly neighborhood," she said to anyone within earshot, "and that means clarity about property lines, rights, and responsibilities." Behind her, a laminated poster read, "Coldwater HOA, for the good of all." She'd planted herself near the cider booth speaker system, too close for it to be coincidence. Walter stood near the edge of the square, hands in the pockets of his worn coat. He observed without intrusion, nodding politely when greeted, but never lingering. His eyes, however, missed nothing, especially not Karen's over-rehearsed smile. Ellie, the cafe waitress barely out of college, slipped out from the jam-tasting tent and walked toward him, clutching a small envelope. "My granddad said you'd want this," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Walter opened it slowly. Inside was a yellowed photograph, 2 men fishing beside Coldwater Lake, and a folded page written in steady cursive. The ink had faded, but the header was clear: "Personal copy, hand-deeded land clause, 1971. His brow furrowed just slightly as he folded it back. "You sure?" he asked quietly. Ellie nodded. "He said your dad kept the original, but gave him this after the vote went south." From across the square, Sheriff Alden leaned against the side of the pie contest tent, arms crossed. He watched the interaction, unreadable as always, eyes never settling long. Meanwhile, under the shade of the sugar maple near the music stage, a pair of elderly residents, Eugene and Marla Thompson, shared a cider bench with an out-of-town cousin. Their voices carried, half reminiscing, half wondering. Back in '82, Eugene was saying, Walter's daddy made a stink at a council meeting. Said the cabin had clause protections older than the HOA charter. Folks laughed him off, but he had papers. And a backbone, Marla added. Didn't let nobody tell him where his fence should go. These whispers meandered through the festival, slow and sticky like molasses on a cold plate. By the time they reached the honey stall, they'd turned into rumors: Walter owns the lake. Karen doesn't have legal claim. The sheriff's just waiting for the right time. And Karen, well, Karen sensed it. She motioned to the speaker system operator and stepped onto the low wooden platform near the pumpkin patch stage. She tapped the microphone. The sound boomed softly over the fairgrounds. "Neighbors and friends," she began, tone measured, eyes scanning. "We love Coldwater for its values, order, safety, community. But we cannot let ourselves be misled by whispers. Certain individuals refuse to cooperate with guidelines designed to protect all of us. They hide behind stories and loopholes. And I ask you, what does that tell you about their intentions?" Heads turned. Some frowned. Others crossed their arms. Walter, still near the cider booth, said nothing. Karen's voice rose slightly. "This is no longer just a disagreement over paperwork. It's about endangerment, legal, civic, and personal." She pointed toward him, microphone in hand. "Walter Rowe has refused to comply with the HOA's rightful jurisdiction. And I believe maybe it's time we all heard who really owns what." The words landed like sleet on a windshield, sharp, cold, unexpected. Sheriff Alden had stepped up beside the stage, hands in his coat, eyes forward. His voice had cut through Karen's crescendo like a steel string snapping. The crowd shifted. Even the fiddle player stopped mid-note. Walter's face remained still, but his gaze met the sheriff's across the square. Ellie clutched the envelope just a little tighter behind her apron. The air, suddenly, had no music. Only waiting. Everyone thought it was just folklore, until legal papers surfaced that could shatter the HOA's grip. The folding chairs in the Coldwater Community Center creaked under the weight of unease. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile glare on the linoleum floor. A coffee station sat near the exit, styrofoam cups, non-dairy creamer, and a half-used tub of powdered sugar for donuts no one touched. Karen adjusted her blazer with jerky hands, trying to look composed as she shuffled a stack of documents. The room was half full, yet the air was thicker than during the usual monthly meetings. She cleared her throat. "Thank you all for attending this emergency session of the Coldwater Ridge HOA," she began, tapping the gavel once, just a bit too hard. "We're here to address some recent confusion over property jurisdictions. This is not a trial. It's clarification." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. Sheriff Alden leaned against the back wall, arms folded, face unreadable. He wasn't in uniform. That choice alone made the board uneasy. Walter entered quietly, holding a manila envelope under one arm. His boots made little sound on the tile, but heads turned anyway. He gave a polite nod, moved past the folding chairs, and took the empty seat across from Karen. Karen's smile was taut. "Mr. Rowe, as you've challenged our right to enforce HOA code on your residence and the surrounding property, we invite you to provide documentation." Walter opened the envelope and pulled out 3 items, a yellowed zoning document, a folded land survey map, and a handwritten deed copy. "This," he said calmly, placing the deed at the center of the table, "was hand-transferred in 1971, witnessed and notarized. It includes a clause exempting parcels adjacent to the Coldwater perimeter from annexation by any future body, unless unanimous consent is filed by original owners or their descendants." Karen's fingers twitched. "That's not, our charter includes a clause." Walter continued, unfolding the map. "This," he said, "matches the county's archived records. You'll see the lines in red, my father marked them back then. They include the cabin, the east dock, and the section of lakefront that's been under question." The room shifted. Murmurs grew. "Let's see it," said Alan Murray, one of the older board members. He leaned forward, squinting at the brittle paper. "This looks authentic." Karen interjected, voice rising slightly. "There's no record in our files." Sheriff Alden spoke from the back. "That might be because your files only date to '84. County Registry has older ones." A long silence followed. Then Jeanette Cho, the treasurer, flipped through the HOA bylaws Karen had distributed earlier. Her brow furrowed. "There's a note," she said slowly, "about pending exemption review for Parcel Group B. It's dated in the margins, 1995. The same year the HOA charter was renewed." Walter nodded once. "And the same year I took ownership, by deed." "I thought that was hearsay," Alan muttered. "Never knew anyone had the original." Karen's voice cracked. But the vote, there was no petition." Walter tapped the last document. "A certified letter was sent to your predecessor. I kept the return receipt." He slid it forward. More shifting. Bickering broke out among board members in low tones, phrases like "we were never told," and "this changes everything," floated up like mist. The gavel landed again, but this time it was Jeanette who tapped it. "We should motion for a recess to review these in committee." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted from face to face, looking for support. None came. Walter stood. He took a moment to slide the documents back into the envelope, each fold deliberate. Then he looked directly at Karen. "This lake hasn't been yours for a long time, and neither has that cabin." He turned and walked out, his boots silent again, but the message trailing behind like smoke. Behind him, the board members sat frozen, the fragile structure of control finally showing its cracks. And in the corner, Sheriff Alden allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "The HOA calls for an emergency vote, hoping to expel Eli from the neighborhood." The Rose Hill Community Center buzzed with the low murmur of folding chairs being dragged into rows and casserole lids being peeled back. It was the kind of chilly November evening where coats were worn inside and everyone brought something warm, from baked beans to spiced pumpkin loaf. The overhead fluorescents flickered once before settling into a steady hum. Eli Turner stood near the back wall, not hiding but not seeking attention either. His flannel shirt was neatly pressed, hands clasped in front of him. A table nearby held a modest pot of his venison stew, half empty already. A few neighbors nodded toward him, some cautiously, others with small, knowing smiles. Karen Bellwood adjusted the microphone with more force than necessary. "Thank you, everyone, for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice clipped. "This emergency meeting was called due to serious concerns over unregistered occupancy and non-compliance with HOA bylaws, specifically regarding Mr. Eli Turner's residency on the lake perimeter." Several heads turned toward Eli. He didn't move. Karen continued. "We've seen unauthorized woodcutting, mysterious deliveries, and other unlogged activities, none of which support the standards of safety and order that this community is built upon." Sheriff Amos, seated near the front in a folding chair too small for his frame, cleared his throat. Far as I can tell, Eli's within his rights on his land. That cabin predates the HOA. And so do most of our memories of it. There was a pause, then a chuckle from someone near the cider table. Karen's jaw tensed. Be that as it may, this isn't personal. It's about precedent. In the third row, a younger couple, Julia and Matteo, exchanged glances. Matteo raised his hand. Just a question, has the board ever published a breakdown of where the HOA fees go? I noticed our snow removal hasn't exactly been timely this year. Karen opened her mouth, but was cut off by Jeanette from the treasurer's table. The invoices haven't been fully circulated. Karen was going to. I didn't say that, Karen snapped, then immediately softened her tone. They're in review. A rustle moved through the room like leaves in wind. From the back, a frail voice rose. I got a letter this summer. Quiet. No return address. Said my porch plants were a hazard. Told me to remove them or face a fine. It was Mrs. Whitaker, wrapped in a shawl, her cane leaning against the chair. I asked around. No one else got one. And I've been here since my Charlie laid the foundation with his own hands in '68. Eli's expression didn't change, but the weight in the room did. Karen flushed. That wasn't official. It had your signature, Mrs. Whitaker said gently. I checked. Murmurs turned into words. This vote was supposed to be about Eli, someone muttered. Maybe it still is, Matteo said. Maybe it's about how he quietly helped plow our drive after the snowstorm in March. Or brought firewood when my dad's hands went stiff last week. Karen gripped the microphone. We're here to vote. That's the motion. Expulsion from the HOA. But no one moved to support it. Instead, a board member stood and said, I motion to suspend current leadership of the HOA pending an external audit. Hands went up. More than half. Karen's face blanched. And then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out instinctively, eyes flicking to the screen. A single message. We need to talk about the invoices. R. The sheriff drives up to the lake and waves at Eli, who is sipping coffee on the porch. Got a moment? The lake shimmered beneath the morning sun, its surface catching the first fine dusting of snow. A thin layer clung to the edges of the pine needles and the wooden railings of the cabin porch. Wood smoke curled from Eli's chimney, mixing with the crisp air and the scent of peppermint pie wafting from Mabel's diner down the road, the start of their annual December giveaway. Eli sat in his old flannel jacket, the same faded green one from 100 cold mornings past, holding a thick ceramic mug in both hands. The steam from the coffee rose in soft curls, and he watched the ripples where ducks dipped and vanished near the shoreline. The rumble of tires on gravel didn't startle him. Sheriff Amos's county SUV came to a slow stop near the old stone marker that once served as a neighborhood notice post. Caution tape still fluttered from the shuttered HOA office across the lake, silent now, like a relic from a time that passed in whispers rather than ceremony. The door creaked open. Got a moment? Amos called, lifting a hand. Eli nodded once and motioned to the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a minute, the wind rattling dry cattails at the edge of the dock. The county finished their review, Amos said finally. Misused funds, falsified violation notices, a couple backdated documents that shouldn't have existed. Eli didn't answer. He just sipped. She resigned, Amos added. Karen. Cited health reasons. Can't say I disagree. Eli gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. The HOA's been suspended. Board under audit. County'll appoint an interim advisory council. They want someone local. Familiar. Balanced. This time Eli turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. They're asking for you, Amos said. Not as chair. Just, someone to keep it honest. Eli chuckled, deep and low. Didn't even have a mailbox until last year. Exactly why they trust you, Amos said, smirking. A small blue pickup rolled past slowly. Levi was in the driver's seat, glancing toward the cabin. In the back bed, bundled brush and pine debris, neatly stacked. He parked a few yards up the hill and got out, walking quietly toward the tree line. He didn't wave. But he paused just long enough to meet Eli's eye. "Thanks," he said, then turned to work, clearing the edge of the property where the snow was starting to gather. "Funny," Amos said, watching the young man go. "Didn't think we'd see him again. Word is, he checked on her last week. No shouting. Just quiet." Eli didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted, less guarded, maybe. Down the road, Mabel's chalkboard sign read, "Peppermint pie today, 1 slice per smile." Sheriff Amos stood. "Got one more thing," he said, pulling a plain envelope from his coat. He handed it over. "From Alan, the old treasurer. Found it in his papers. Wanted you to have it." Eli opened it slowly. Inside was a notarized document, dated years ago but refiled recently. "Deed transfer, boat launch parcel A7. Donated in gratitude." Eli exhaled slowly, reading the name at the bottom. Alan's signature was shaky, but it was there. So was the county seal. He looked out at the shoreline where the old launch sagged under time and cold. The same spot his father had used to push out aluminum boats back in the 70s. The same launch the HOA once tried to padlock. He smiled, then picked up the shovel. Winter was coming, but so was the new dock. The sheriff drives up to the lake and waves at Eli, who is sipping coffee on the porch. "Got a moment?" The lake shimmered beneath the morning sun, its surface catching the first fine dusting of snow. A thin layer clung to the edges of the pine needles and the wooden railings of the cabin porch. Wood smoke curled from Eli's chimney, mixing with the crisp air and the scent of peppermint pie wafting from Mabel's diner down the road, the start of their annual December giveaway. Eli sat in his old flannel jacket, the same faded green one from 100 cold mornings past, holding a thick ceramic mug in both hands. The steam from the coffee rose in soft curls, and he watched the ripples where ducks dipped and vanished near the shoreline. The rumble of tires on gravel didn't startle him. Sheriff Amos's county SUV came to a slow stop near the old stone marker that once served as a neighborhood notice post. Caution tape still fluttered from the shuttered HOA office across the lake, silent now, like a relic from a time that passed in whispers rather than ceremony. The door creaked open. "Got a moment?" Amos called, lifting a hand. Eli nodded once and motioned to the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a minute, the wind rattling dry cattails at the edge of the dock. "The county finished their review," Amos said finally. "Misused funds, falsified violation notices, a couple backdated documents that shouldn't have existed." Eli didn't answer. He just sipped. "She resigned," Amos added. "Karen. Cited health reasons. Can't say I disagree." Eli gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. "The HOA's been suspended. Board under audit. County'll appoint an interim advisory council. They want someone local. Familiar. Balanced." This time Eli turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "They're asking for you," Amos said. "Not as chair. Just someone to keep it honest." Eli chuckled, deep and low. "Didn't even have a mailbox until last year." "Exactly why they trust you," Amos said, smirking. A small blue pickup rolled past slowly. Levi was in the driver's seat, glancing toward the cabin. In the back bed, bundled brush and pine debris, neatly stacked. He parked a few yards up the hill and got out, walking quietly toward the tree line. He didn't wave. But he paused just long enough to meet Eli's eye. "Thanks," he said, then turned to work, clearing the edge of the property where the snow was starting to gather. "Funny," Amos said, watching the young man go. "Didn't think we'd see him again. Word is, he checked on her last week. No shouting. Just quiet." Eli didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted, less guarded, maybe. Down the road, Mabel's chalkboard sign read, "Peppermint pie today, 1 slice per smile." Sheriff Amos stood. "Got one more thing," he said, pulling a plain envelope from his coat. He handed it over. "From Alan, the old treasurer. Found it in his papers. Wanted you to have it." Eli opened it slowly. Inside was a notarized document, dated years ago but refiled recently. Deed transfer, boat launch parcel A7. Donated in gratitude. Eli exhaled slowly, reading the name at the bottom. Alan's signature was shaky, but it was there. So was the county seal. He looked out at the shoreline where the old launch sagged under time and cold. The same spot his father had used to push out aluminum boats back in the 70s. The same launch the HOA once tried to padlock. He smiled, then picked up the shovel. Winter was coming, but so was the new dock. The snow came quietly that December, blanketing the lake and softening the echo of old arguments. Where rules once ruled by fear, a quiet porch and a steaming mug had done more to restore peace than any policy ever could. When good folk stand firm with patience and truth, even the deepest roots of misuse begin to crack. Perhaps it's never too late to join hands with neighbors, to reclaim not just property, but dignity. And sometimes, all it takes to thaw a frozen system is one steady soul with a shovel and a plan.